Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of How Grief is Impacting Our Clients. My name is Katie Ressler. I'm a transformative grief guide, licensed counselor, author of the book, The New Face of Grief, and creator of the Legacy Growth Certification Program. I am here with Dr. Mekel, and we're going to be talking about our clients who are getting married and how hidden grief is showing up in their lives. We'll probably throw in some other stuff in there too. When Dr. Mekel and I get together, we have a lot of stuff to talk about, but our focus will try to be your clients who are getting married. So, Dr. Mekel, what do you do? Where do you do it? And who do you serve?
First of all, Katie, thank you for inviting me to your table. I never take that for granted, so I just appreciate the time. My name is Dr. Mekel Harris. I am a licensed psychologist and health service provider and certified advanced grief specialist who I'm practicing currently in the Mid-South, Tennessee to be specific. And I work with clients across the lifespan. I really love that pediatric population, but I do serve adults as well with a specialty area in grief and loss.
Awesome. So do you tend to see your clients more online? Are you doing in person? I always love asking fellow coaches and clinicians, how are you doing it now? Because, things have changed.
Yeah, so I exclusively see people in person. And, at this point, Katie, I've actually dodged this global bullet, AKA COVID, have continued to see patients in person. And it's been a wonderful gift. Every now and then I'll do some telehealth sessions, but primarily I see folks in person.
Love it. Oh, that's awesome. Good. Next question. What are some of the key issues you're finding clients are coming to you for?
Yeah, so along the lines of hidden grief, I think that COVID really sort of erupted a lot of grief and loss symptoms in folks. Yeah. And so in 2020, people started to come in with sort of, I'm not really sure why I'm feeling stress. I'm not really sure why I'm feeling down, just sort of a heaviness. And as we sort of talked, what became clear were these hidden areas of loss, whether it be not being able to sort of participate in their daily routines that they'd already known and these predictable rhythms, or experiencing physical deaths of loved ones, or just changes in how their family structure and the losses associated with that. So that's primarily been the focal point. Of course, I work with individuals with diagnosable depression and anxiety, but a lot of it has been life adjustment, life transition associated with losses.
Yeah, I love how you pointed out that they come with that, I'm not sure why I'm feeling, I'm not sure why I'm thinking this, or this keeps occurring.
Yes.
Because often that is what pulls somebody into getting more clarity in their lives. Like this keeps coming up, this feeling, this something at the core of me feels off balance or not quite together. And it usually is connected to hidden grief, but because we have associated traditional grief with death,
right?
We go like, well, I know I had this death or this loss, but what is this? What is this other piece?
Yeah, as I've sat with folks and sort of, I usually like to do a bit of a chronology with my clients, because I think it helps them sort of paint a picture of themselves over time. And so as I was sitting with folks, and obviously it's 2022, but we're sort of doing this chronology for the past several years, inevitably there'll be this aha moment where people are going, oh, now I understand why I'm feeling so stressed or withdrawn or isolated and so forth. And so it really has become important to speak about grief in non-traditional ways, if you will.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Before we dive into our specific type of client we're going to talk about today, let's talk about what hidden grief is. So you're going to hear us bring up that term. It's also called disenfranchised grief, and it's grief that society typically doesn't acknowledge as something you should be grieving. Right. So it can show up with healthcare issues. It can show up with divorce, separation, even boundaries in a family when you have to maybe cut ties with a family member. Pet loss sometimes can even be hidden grief because the people around you think it's ridiculous. You're still mourning and grieving the loss of a pet 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. Or even a pet that's unusual. I've had clients who've had horses or snakes, and people just aren't like, what? why is this? It's not like your cat or dog that was in your house all the time. It's like, okay, it still can create grief. And so what happens is we experience this hidden grief and we sort of ball it all inside of us, and we feel shame and guilt and embarrassment around it. And it shows up as overwhelmed, stressed, insomnia, digestive issues, all of these other things. So let's dive into, why would hidden grief show up for somebody who's getting married? Dr. Mekel, like, it's a happy time, right? Why would it show up?
Well, I'll share as a point of disclosure. I am recently engaged. I got engaged about a year ago. And obviously, it's a glorious time to think about your future with someone and the opportunities inherent in marriage and that partnership. What I found, not only with myself, but also others who have experienced this type of grief, is that alongside that excitement and planning is the hidden grief of the loss of expectations and sort of the loss of vision. So I'll share from my own personal experience. Both of my parents have died, my mom in December 2012 and my dad in March 2020. And I'll be honest, I never imagined in my life that I would be married without my parents being at the wedding. And so as I prepared for my wedding, it's come in waves of, extreme excitement and joy. And at the same time, a profound sense of sadness, knowing that my vision for my wedding is completely different than what I ever thought my life would look like. And so I think it can certainly come up along the planning in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. I think there's that piece of when a particular family member, especially a core one, is not present, that we feel it different timings throughout the planning process and day of, and even after.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes hidden grief shows up for those getting married as well. When you bring two lives together, there's a lot of compromises.
There are.
And if you've got that Pinterest board, how you want it all to look, and you met somebody who maybe has their own Pinterest board, how they all want to look, you start to really learn the early stages, right? Of like, oh, this is what partnership may look like.
Right.
And there can be grief work around the letting go. And it seems so silly to say, well, it's, even I find sometimes clients like picking colors, picking a photographer, picking food can lead to so many arguments that there is this like letting go of dreams or expectations that never really involve the other person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, as I've worked with clients who are navigating a similar path, the idea, again, that this vision doesn't align with the reality. If anyone who's listening is familiar with or has heard of acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the people who is sort of core in that philosophy is Russ Harris. And what he talks about, which I love, is this chasm between vision and reality. And in between there is called the reality gap. And that's where that tension resides. That's where that hidden grief can erupt in symptoms of irritation, miscommunication or lack of communication, internalized stress, depression, overwhelm. And so it really is shining a light in that reality gap to sort of make sense of what is, while at the same time figuring out ways to suspend or adjust the vision so that there's not so much suffering in the reality gap. And it's difficult because you're right. A wedding can provoke a lot of hidden grief associated with expectations of the day between two people, or also if you've experienced physical losses and so forth. So it's a lot of grief work that has to go into that process.
I was even just thinking, especially in these times right now, the financial part of it, how that can bring up a lot of our own grief around money or generational grief around money when maybe the funds are not there like you had pictured in that how this would look, or going back to the need for compromising. Maybe 5 years ago it would have looked different, and now it is exactly what you said. There's like that center ground where it just feels like, and we do have to do that that grief work to reconcile and almost balance out, but what can come of this? What can this look like? I'm
Right.
also reminded again, and you probably are familiar with this test as well. There's it's like the life stress test. It's a 50 different things that
Yep.
happen in life.
Yep.
The top two highest, and the top two highest scoring experiences are the death of a family member
Yep.
and getting married.
And marriage. That's right.
And people will say, this
Well,
was supposed to be the best day of my life.
right. And so yeah, and I would argue it's so interesting, like the death of a loved one and marriage are in some ways one and the same, right? So the death of a loved one is like another physical person, but that idea of dying to yourself, right, in the spirit of compromise and having to make sacrifices is also a death. And so it makes sense that those are the top two, because it is sort of a shedding of yourself in a compromised fashion in order to get to the end goal in a healthy and positive way. Yeah.
So Dr. Mekel and I are here to say, if you're getting married, grief is normal.
Yeah.
It's normal. Like whether you've lost someone or not, it will show up. And you did a great job of naming what some of those symptoms will be. Feeling irritated and angry and uncomfortable and stressed out. I find even some of the perfectionism and people pleasing that comes out in all of it is also that there's something there.
Yes.
I
think that people, sort of, and this is sort of also predicated on your personality style and just sort of things that you've experienced historically in relationships, but certainly functioning in that perfectionistic space and the social comparisons that can also crop up in wedding planning and weddings themselves, that can sort of lead us to this false vision and illusion. And then the people pleasing, right? Like not wanting to disappoint as you are interacting with your own family or your partner's family, sort of suspending that to enjoy the day, but also dying to self, if you will, in order that other people can equally participate in that process as well. Yeah, it's a lot.
So you're fresh in the process right now of planning a wedding and also honoring the space for grief. You're the perfect person for me to ask this to. What are the tools you're using? Because I think often, especially on these episodes, I just talk about like, where's hidden grief showing? But you are in it. So I can say, what tools are you using? I'm usually just talking to experts who are like outside of it. You're in it. What are the tools you're using?
Yeah, I think one of the most critical, I would say probably the most critical tool in navigating grief, whether with wedding planning or otherwise, is naming the grief, naming the reality of what you're facing. So I think oftentimes we are resistant, as you said before, of even saying that we are grieving because it feels sort of icky. We don't want to bring that quote unquote sadness into the space. But the reality is, if you can name the fact that, you know what, I am grieving that I am surrendering a part of myself in order to align and wed to someone else. I am surrendering my sense of identity and independence and to unify and partner with someone. I am suspending the vision I had for the event itself to align with the reality of what we can afford and so forth. To name that is really powerful so that when those moments come up, the tendency to criticize yourself, to judge yourself, and to be critical of the process as a whole is minimized, because you know that these junctures are going to happen along the way. So I would say that's been a really important tool that I've used. And then the other thing is just simply focusing on grounding practices. You've probably talked about this in your own work, but figuring out a way, and this is different for everyone, to sort of be with yourself. And as you notice what I call sort of that internal prickliness, arising, how can you help anchor and basically calm your nervous system? And there's many ways to do this. I love physical touch. That's one of my love languages. But to be able to ground yourself through physically touching yourself to help anchor your body, physically grounding your feet on the floor and using diaphragmatic breathing as a way to just be with yourself, or going out and taking a walk and spending time in nature and enveloping the sights, sounds, smells. These are all opportunities to ground, which brings you back to the ability to clearly and healthily sort of navigate the grief that shows up. If not, we're sort of all over the place, and that's just not good for anyone, you most importantly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see two things happen. We'll either have what I call monkey brain, like, or it's like we cut our head off from the rest of our body and we're like, I'm only here. I will not feel anything that's going on. So I love that you said no, ground. Go back, attach, be here. Don't be spinning out, be present.
Be present.
And that can be uncomfortable. So if at first it feels uncomfortable, you're doing something right.
Yes, that means you're getting to where you need to be.
Right.
Yes.
I'd love to say to clients, it's like you've always crossed your arms this way, and all of a sudden you learn to cross them a different way, and it feels uncomfortable and wrong, and like this shouldn't be this way. It's because you're training yourself in a different way of doing things.
Yeah.
And grief work feels uncomfortable because it's a different way of doing things, right? And grounding too sometimes feels like, oh, this feels weird.
It feels weird. Yeah. Well, and I think it's in the stillness of it all, which can be uncomfortable if you're one that's a doer. And I'm raising my hand because I'm an accomplisher. I like to get things done. I like to check things off. At the same time, there's something about being still and sitting in that discomfort where insights come. Sometimes we're so busy wedding planning and making phone calls and completing tasks that we're not really focusing on the anxiety that may be sort of ruminating in our bodies, or the fact that we're not connecting with our partner healthily because we're too busy checking off things on a to-do list. And so the stillness can be really powerful. And then the other thing I want to add is to be okay not only naming and identifying grief for yourself, but having to tell someone that, to be okay with saying, man, I didn't think, and I've said this a million times over the past year, I had very much an idealized perspective about marriage. And I would hear people say, other couples say, well, it's so much work, it's so much this. And I thought, oh, maybe because you married the wrong person and that's why it's so tricky. No, that's not going to happen for my sweetheart and I. And then you get to that juncture and you realize, wow, I didn't realize the amount of effort, sacrifice, compromise, constant communication that was required in order to be a successfully engaged person, let alone marriage.
Yeah.
And I think the more that we can open up about that, we're able to get the perspective of, yeah, me too, right? I didn't know either. How can we support one another, which is so valuable?
I love that. I will end us with a tool because like the couples therapist in me is like, let me throw. But this is also for those grieving and feeling that hidden grief, the power of going for a walk, a 15, 20-minute walk together or by yourself.
We just did that this morning.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yes. Because sometimes, especially if we're like butting heads on something, just the power of like, don't talk for the first 10 minutes, just walk. And then imagine you got to slow down your walking because you'll be like, so power walk. And then you start to talk. And my husband and I had the best compromises on walks because first we weren't staring at each other. The second we were like, relax.
Yeah.
And in grief, it's the same way. That walking, you'll find yourself walk really fast. And if you walk slower, then all of a sudden it's grounding. And it's like, what's really going on with me? And it can be a beautiful space of feeling like you're doing, you're walking.
That's right.
And grounding.
And grounding.
I love that.
I love this idea that you said as a couple, the idea of you're both looking forward, not at each other. That same thing is true with grief. Sometimes we are coming up against it and we feel that, or we're perceiving that the threat of grief, right? Staring grief in the face can feel very threatening. And so on that walk, grief is looking forward, you're looking forward. And over time, you're able to walk alongside it where you don't feel that sense of threat and there's a better sense of alignment. So we're really, really powerful.
That's such a great analogy. Our powers combined. There's the analogy. I love it.
Always.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay. the next question I usually ask it, and because we're in the mental health and clinical field, it's a great question. How do you find that psychologists and counselors, what areas are they lacking around the knowledge around hidden grief in specific? And how could they better educate themselves?
Yes, I think again, I sort of go back to my master's and doctoral training, and sadly enough, there really aren't any specific grief and loss courses that are required. Now, there are some elective
Yep.
courses that you can take if that's sort of a focal point that you're interested in, but it's not part of the general curriculum. So I think one thing that can be done is really more of a infrastructure within training programs. When I worked in academia, I was sort of hired to build out this curriculum, and with a little bit of, I don't want to call it fighting, a little bit of tension and conversation, I eventually was able to help the folks around me realize how important it is to embed topics about grief and loss really throughout the curriculum, because it's going to show up. So I definitely think there's some training and curriculum changes. With regard to psychologists and clinicians who are already participating in CEs and courses and just informational workshops on grief will help uncover that we're not just talking about physical death. We're including that, but that's not the only space of grief that matters. And again, I think this is one of the positive outgrowths of COVID, is that we realized that, yes, it included people who physically died, but it was people not going to graduations. It was having to stunt and stop your entire social network in an instant, and many other hidden losses that created sort of this mental health frenzy, right? And so I think COVID has helped elevate that conversation, and hopefully conversations like ours will continue to inspire people to educate themselves.
I agree. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Mekel, if somebody wants to work with you or get in contact with you or ask you questions, how can they find you?
Yeah, so you're welcome to explore my website, which is www.mekelharrisphd. That's mekelharrisphd.com. I spend a lot of time, as Katie knows, over on Instagram, and so you can definitely check me out. My handle is Dr. Mekel, DrMekel. If you could click the link in my bio, you'll have access to some free resources. I'm also going to be becoming an Enneagram coach in the new year, so that's going to be another offering. And there's also some paid opportunities to grab some resources and work with me individually. So definitely check that out for sure.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And the last question everyone gets.
Okay.
What is the funniest experience you've ever had doing the work that you do?
Oh gosh. Okay. This isn't funny. Well, this isn't funny, but it was to me. So I want to be sensitive that when you work in community mental health and you're sort of in an outpatient environment, you never know what's going to walk through the door. And I had an opportunity to sit down with someone who arrived in a head to toe clown suit.
Oh, wow.
This was years ago, not associated with Halloween or any, costume experience.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, maybe that's his job. Maybe that is, he's a special day for his kid.
Right. Oh, wow.
And so I found myself sitting there, and I'm full makeup, full nose, everything.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, clowns sort of freak me out. So that was a whole nother thing happening in the background. But I had to actively fight not to sort of giggle throughout the whole
or not smile in the
and not match this big clown smile. So I'm sitting there like, oh, and just having that internal giggle going on. That was probably the funniest and oddest interaction I've ever had in my career.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think I would have I hold it together.
Yes.
Sometimes we have the best poker faces, and then afterwards it's like
Well, and then the tough part was what we were talking about was really serious, but of course it didn't match this clown face. And so it was so much going on that was so incongruent.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And of course our scientific mind is going okay, but like, is he matching his, I don't know, is this
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
relevant or not? I don't
Yes.
know. So,
Yeah.
oh goodness. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for being on my video series. I always
Absolutely.
love chatting with you, of course.
Yeah.
And if you've watched this and you'd like to learn more about hidden grief and how to work with your clients around that topic, go to my website, katiebressler.com, click on the link certification, and you'll learn more about the program coming up at the end of January. Okay, everyone, have a wonderful week. And thank you again, Dr. Mekel.